Welcome back. This is the second in the series of videos designed to get you started with data analysis in Google Sheets. This video is going to cover 3 introductory steps to get you started with data analysis. And then the subsequent videos we're going to consider specific research questions and how to explore them using pivot tables and graphics. Okay, let's get started. So remember our data from the last video. The first thing I want to do to this collection of data is add a unique ID for each one of the participants inside of our survey. In order to do this, I'm going to create a new column to the left of all of my data. The quick way to do this is to select the column all the way to the left. You can just click on the box at the top with an A in it. And then if you right-click this, you can do Insert One Left. And this is just going to insert one column to the left of A. Everything's going to be relabeled, so now the column that was formerly A is now B, and now we can put in our unique IDs into A. So let's give it a title, Unique ID. And now I want to show you a very quick way of filling down, counting up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. All you have to do is start with the first 2, and Google Sheets is going to be able to recognize the pattern just from these first 2 cells. It can see that you're trying to count by ones, or at least this is common enough that it can make an educated guess. So if you just highlight the first 2 cells with the 1 and the 2, and then notice it in the lower right-hand corner of those 2 highlighted cells, there's a blue box, and if you hover over it, you change from an arrow to a crosshairs. If you hover over so that you're in the crosshairs and you double-click, this is going to automatically fill with that counting pattern, counting up by ones, all the way down to the end of your data. So I'm going to use my control down to double check that we've gone all the way down to the end, and it seems like we've stopped in the appropriate place. Now we can see that since we started in cell 2, counting as the first person, when we get to the bottom, we actually have 100 participants in this, not 101 as the default row label over here would suggest. Okay, now that we have our unique ID, the next thing I want to do is look for missing data. This is very common in surveys. People decide not to answer a question or they miss a question, whatever the case may be. And when you're just looking at a large volume of data like this, it's really hard to see where somebody left out some information. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start by highlighting everything inside of our data sheet. So you can remember, either use the command A to select all of your data, or if you start in the upper left corner, you can hold Command and Shift, move to the right, and then move down. Either way, you want all of your data highlighted, and we're going to use a trick called conditional formatting. So with your data highlighted, we're going to go into the Format tab, and we're going to find conditional formatting as our option. And what should happen is in the right, a little dialog box is going to open up, and we're going to be able to set some options. Since we already selected our range, we don't have to worry about apply to range. Format cells if. This is where we're going to identify what types of cells we want to format. We're looking for missing data, so we're looking for empty cells. And we can change the color however we want. I want to flag them in red so that they're easier to see. And then when you're done setting up the specifications of your conditional formatting, you can just hit Done. You can exit out of the conditional format rules, and now we can take a closer look at our data. So at this point, all of the cells inside of our Google Sheet that are missing data, all the cells that are empty, will be highlighted in red, but we can't see them very effectively at the current zoom level. So here's a couple of tricks if you want to just take a quick visual look at where your missing data occurs. One thing to change is your zoom. The smallest zoom allowed in Google Sheets right now is 50%, and this helps a little bit. Another thing that you might notice is that the column widths are very wide. So here's a way to deal with that. Click on the column all the way to the left, hold down your Shift key, and then just scroll over to the end of your data. And with the Shift held down, click on the last one. Now, what this does is it highlights all of the different columns. And now, if you hover over a division between 2 columns, you should get an arrow. And this arrow allows you to adjust the width of the column. So if you make these things skinnier, it's going to collapse most of your data, but now it's a lot more visible. And you can kind of see which one of your variables and which one of your rows has the missing data. So it makes things a little bit more visible. This will give you a sense of where your missing data falls. What exactly you want to do with your missing data is something you should discuss with your professors. Right. To undo this formatting, I'm just going to hit Control-Z, and I'm going to turn my, my zoom back to 100%. Okay, our last task for this video is showing you how to set up a pivot table inside of Google Sheets. Pivot tables are extremely useful for data analysis, and the subsequent videos are going to go over how to use data analysis to investigate associations between two of your variables. For now, what I want to do is just show you how to make one, and I'll give you a quick demonstration of some of what it can do. The first thing we want to do is highlight all of our data. So again, we're going to use either the Control-A approach, or we're going to start in the upper left. We'll hold down Control and Shift, use the right arrow to collect the appropriate columns, and the down arrow to make sure we collect all the rows. All right, once everything is selected, we're going to go into the Data tab, and we're going to go down to Pivot Table. And when we click Pivot Table, a new sheet is going to open at the bottom, and it's going to be called Pivot Table with some sort of enumeration, depending on how many times you've run a pivot table in this particular Google Sheet. So when I click Pivot Table, I get a new sheet, so I can jump back to my raw data if I need to. I get Pivot Table 9, and over here, the Pivot Table editor is what we're going to use primarily. To demonstrate the utility of a pivot table, I would just want to walk you through a very quick example. If you happen to click outside of the pivot table, the editor disappears. So if that happens to you, just remember to click back maybe into the rows and it'll reappear. So here's the idea. Each one of these rows, columns, values, filters is going to add a certain element to your pivot table. So what we want to do, we're going to start with rows, and we click on the Add, and what we see is a drop down of all of the column titles from your data set. So in other words, what we're doing here is selecting a particular variable to associate to our rows. In my case, I want to look at age, so I'm going to select variable 5 or question 5 for my rows. And you'll notice that once it's selected, we have each one of the unique possible answers for age group appearing inside of our rows. Now, the pivot table itself is empty, and the reason it's empty is because we haven't specified the values we want to include in the middle of the table. Okay? So, to add values, what we're going to do is click on the Add button, and we're going to choose a variable on which to base our values. You can either use unique ID, or you could, in this case, choose how old are you again. I'm going to use how old are you again. And if you look very quickly at the pivot table, it looks like it's counting up the unique instances of 18 to 25 responses, 26 to 32 responses, etc. So this gives us a sense of the distribution of survey participants to the different age groups for our study. You'll notice what's happening here is it's taking the different possible answers for how old are you. And again, if we pop back into the data and we look at that, all of the answers are either 18 to 25, 60 or older, etc., etc. And it's applying a certain function to them. In this case, we're applying a function called COUNT-A. And what this does is it simply just counts whether or not a cell is empty or not. Since we've specified that our rows are going to be broken up by the different possible answers to this question, what this is doing is it's looking through all of the information and counting up each instance of an 18 to 25 response and reporting that as the value inside of our pivot table. And then it would look at each instance of a 26 to 32 response and then sum those up and report that as the value of inside of our pivot table. Now, one of the nice things about using a pivot table is you can actually explore two variables at once and possibly even three, but I think two variables is easiest to see. And the way to do this is to just add a different variable into the columns. So if I go into the columns option and I click Add, now what I can do is find a different question that I want to compare against age, so perhaps gender. I'm looking at maybe the demographics of my survey respondents. And if I click gender, not only do I get a breakup by unique age response, but now I also get across the columns a breakup by each gender response. So I can see, for example, that there were a total of 78 18 to 25 responders, 3 identified as other, 13 identified as male, and 62 identified as female. So you can see that pivot tables are a really excellent way to start exploring some aggregate information about your data and eventually exploring associations between 2 different variables. So we'll be using them quite a bit in the next video when we start to consider some research questions.